So I'll move on to discussing the other side of hematopathology practice that's near and dear to my heart, which is lymphoid malignancies. And I was very impressed, actually, when I was a fellow, that the concept that the NGS variant allele frequency is analogous to the peak height on a capillary electropherogram. So the relative proportionality of analyte and sample, or your clonal abundance, could be reflected in a sense by the variant allele frequency, and that was extremely impressive to me. And I was so excited because I had first trained in hempath and then molecular afterwards, and so in my experience, it was the most difficult cases get reflex to PCR for adjudication. And sometimes the most difficult decision, if you have an experience. Let's say I'm looking, at the great masquerader and potential angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma or something like that, or a Hodgkin lymphoma. I've seen cases that you don't even know if it's benign or malignant. So sometimes that's the most difficult decision in clinical hematopathology practice, and then they get reflex to PCR or molecular clonality testing to adjudicate and determine, is it simply clonal, neoplastic, and malignant, or is it benign hyperplastic reactive? So lymphoid malignancies characteristically harbor unique B-cell and T-cell receptor gene rearrangements. TCR and IGH loci consist of somatically rearranged VD and J region DNA segments distributed across chromosomes 14 and 7, and also secondary to somatic hypermutation and other combinatorial diversity. The index DNA sequences correspondent to functional IGH and TCR gene rearrangements are highly specific and represent a very robust, fingerprint, essentially, for clonal cell populations of interest. And they can be used to track disease or identify clonal relatedness at multiple body sites, et cetera. So shown below is, if you have, for example, a polyclonal cellular milieu, you expect a variety of IGH or TCR fragment length products corresponding to the different VDJ recombined sequences. And NGS would delineate multiple sequences, signatures related to each of those IGH and TCR loci that have been rearranged. Oligoclonal populations, for example, shown here, would show up as few predominant peaks. In our laboratory, we used to have a 3-to-1 fold change ratio in PCR for clonal to background assessment, and this is a nice easy example, but having signed out hundreds of these PCR fragment analysis assays for clonality, it's easy when it's obvious, but when you're in many of the cases, it's extremely subjective. Is this above or below your cutoff? And PCR interpretation is known to be highly subjective, and if you speak to the practitioners, it's very unfortunate at times. And if you have, especially, for example, like cellular less diverse samples or paucicellular samples, you can get pseudoclones on these kinds of results. And so here's a monoclonal peak, and then you have a relatively pure sequence pile up. So here is a very interesting to show and highlight the utility of NGS in general in comparison to traditional PCR capillary electrophoresis for clonality detection in mycosis fungoides, the most common T-cell lymphoma involving the skin. And obviously mycosis fungoides and Sézary syndrome are a really important application of TCR gamma and also TCR beta clonality testing in the routine clinical laboratory setting. So mycosis fungoides is the most common cutaneous T-cell neoplasm. However, diagnosis is often challenging. Histologic features often overlap with reactive inflammatory dermatoses, and serial biopsies are often and typically required for diagnosis of particularly early patch or plaque stage disease. If we have any hematopathologists in the audience, you know that these are very cutaneous lymphoid infiltrates are definitely things that we always have to, collaborate with our dermpath colleagues to say, is this, a lupus or some other reactive inflammatory mimicker versus lymphoma? It's very difficult. So that's a key, disease subset where it's clonality testing by molecular is expected. Demonstration of clonal TCR gene rearrangements is often critical in this setting. However, gold standard PCR is known to suffer from insensitivity, and as I mentioned and emphasized, the data analysis can be quite subjective at times. T-cell clonality detection was performed in this study by the conventional EuroBiomed 2 primer set for TCR gamma, and was compared to NGS Illumina sequencing targeting TCR among 34 histologically gold standard FFPE samples of mycosis fungoides. And NGS was deemed clonal if the two most frequent TCR sequences accounted for greater than 5% of total reads. One thing I will say is there is inter-laboratory variability currently among laboratories that are doing NGS or even the PCR clonality in general, that different lab-specific cutoffs for fold change differences between, putative clonal versus background. People use different cutoffs. So that is a relatively conservative cutoff for TCR. At my previous experience, I had a very conservative cutoff established in our laboratory for the NGS, where we did a rule of 5, essentially greater than 5% of total read sequences for a potential clonal call, as well as a greater than 5x fold change between the first and fifth most abundant read sequence to account for potential biallelic biclonal populations that were actually quite common, and I was surprised to see how often you find those in reactive settings. So in this particular published study in Archives of Pathology, it's showing that there was significant discordance between the capillary electrophoresis results shown here and the NGS results shown here. Now, these were gold standard clinical pathologically established mycosis fungoides cases, so they're supposed to be, positive. That's the expected result. And in this particular study, there's less than 50% concordance between NGS and PCR. And capillary electrophoresis PCR sensitivity was only 44%, and NGS sensitivity was actually double that on these expected clonal positive gold standard cases. So the conclusion was NGS significantly improves upon standard PCR detection for T-cell clonality and mycosis fungoides, a clinically challenging but important setting, and demonstration of clonal relatedness based on identification of similar TCR sequences at multiple body sites may assist in diagnosis and exclusion of reactive inflammatory processes. We looked at and utilized LymphoTrack NGS also for B-cell clonality detection as well. So B-cell clonality assessment is an important test in routine clinical hematopathology practice, particularly when morphology or other ancillary testing results are suspicious but otherwise indeterminate for malignancy. As I've mentioned, PCR is a widely utilized standard methodology, and optimal testing approaches incorporating NGS are not yet well standardized or widespread. And so this was from our laboratory that we looked at a variety of lymphoid proliferations and infiltrates, including both benign hyperplastic and clonal neoplastic malignant cases. And shown here is the PCR results, just for color relatedness. You can see there's excellent concordance in this data set. It was about, I think, 21 samples we tested. And again, a variety of infiltrates ranging from, B-cell lymphomas, Castleman disease, to reactive inflammatory conditions, sialadenitis, et cetera. So in this case, I was pretty upset. I said, why is there one that's discordant? What is wrong with that? So otherwise, though, using our criteria that we had set, we had among 20 samples at least, perfect concordance. But the one discordant sample was actually, and we looked back at the case, one of the most difficult cases my partners and I had for that year, actually. It was a 67-year-old woman presenting with ocular proptosis. So she had her eyeball protruding out of its socket, and MRI studies demonstrated a 2.8 centimeter lobulated, homogeneously enhancing orbital mass along the undersurface of the proximal to mid-intraorbital optic nerve segment. That's actually a pretty severe clinical presentation, and it would be pretty unusual to have something like that in the setting of dacrocystitis or lacrimal gland inflammation in the orbit. So clinically, this looks like, a lymphoid malignancy, and head and neck region predilects for marginal zone lymphomas. So then when we took a look at the, needle core, this biopsy fragment, essentially, it's a scant shard of tissue, and I didn't, fault anyone. Well, why didn't you give me more tissue from this person's eye? But that's a pathologist stroke. That's about as funny as I get. So morphologic review on that case with that scant, cellular fragment was basically demonstrating a dense B-cell lymphoid infiltrate. Unfortunately, flow cytometry was unremarkable and polyclonal in that sample, and that's a pretty conventional measure for clonality. When we ran molecular IGH and IgK gene rearrangement studies, they were also negative on the electrophoresis conventional PCR. So that's a pretty exhaustive approach between flow, morphology. The one factor in marginal zone lymphoma infiltrates or cutaneous B-cell infiltrates, and I typically like to use focal plasmacytic differentiation as a handle to suggest possible neoplasia. So in this particular case, it's borderline, but there was a focal excess in plasmacytic elements associated with the infiltrate, but it would be suspicious but not definitive. I couldn't call lymphoma based solely on focal light chain excess on in situ hybridization staining in an otherwise dense morphologic B-cell lymphoplasmacytic infiltrate in the head and neck region. This was a very major problem for me and our partners. And again, it's hard to call lymphoma when your flow cytometry and PCR studies are negative and clearly indicative of polyclonality. So in this case, retrospectively, well after the fact, we ran NGS. I will say the follow-up on this patient was the clinician had decided presumptively that the patient was clinical pathologically still so worrisome for lymphoma that they went ahead and treated with Rituxan, and they patient's disease process did resolve after Rituxan administration. So they treated the patient like lymphoma from the clinical perspective in that particular case. So here was the capillary electrophoresis results here. Shown here are the framework 3 shorter fragment length products showing a nice bell curve distribution. This is the beta globin internal causative control. And then again here, this is the framework 1 region IGH primers. So this is polyclonal, and it's actually a good quality output. In this case, the LymphoTrack data output shows these very clear cut. It's not relatively non-subjective, color-coded proportional distribution for the different sequences delineated. And they give you the VJ utilization profile here along the x-axis, and then the percentage in sample among total reads. So the framework 3 primers are showing like a clonal result. The framework 1, it shows polyclonality. And in this case, this is the data output, and again, it's a digital result. One thing I didn't mention earlier that's a very major advantage of NGS compared to capillary electrophoresis is it's been shown that you can have multiple multiple cell populations with VDJ recombined IGH or TCR loci that give a similar base pair length product, but when you sequence them, those same products have, although the same fragment length on capillary electrophoresis, they'll have different sequences. So NGS has single nucleotide base pair resolution capacity is a major reason why it's also more specific and capable of greater diagnostic resolution than traditional fragment analysis. In this case, the ratio between the first and third most abundant sequences was 5.53, so that actually exceeded, I think at that time we were saying we were still investigating, and I think we said clonality would be a greater than 3x fold change, just similar to our PCR results. But another probable reason why I believe, is the capillary or the NGS can overcome potentially the limitations of PCR. That we know that in neoplasms that are subject to high levels of somatic hypermutation, you can get failure of primer annealing and hence a negative result on PCR. And the massively parallel nature I've just seen anecdotally is able to overcome highly somatically hypermutated samples and still delineate sequences appropriately and clonal results. So that actually is common in marginal zone lymphoma, that they're by definition post-germinal center origin, and hence somatic hypermutation is usually expected. So that is a possible reason why in that particular case the PCR was negative and then the NGS was positive. But that was definitely, I wish I had the NGS result. If I had that NGS result at that time, I just would have called it marginal zone lymphoma. and next case. So it was a real eye-opener for me that the utility of the LymphoTrack NGS application could bring diagnostic resolution to the most difficult and challenging cases of lymphoma versus hyperplastic reactive conditions in the routine clinical laboratory setting. And for our laboratory at the time, the LymphoTrack has a vendor-supplied bioinformatics solution. So all of that is essentially, it's a huge benefit that at the time we didn't have we weren't resource rich for bioinformatics and dry lab annotation solutions. So the vendor-supplied bioinformatics solution associated with the LymphoTrack kit was a major benefit for us to get up and running very quickly using an Illumina MiSeq sequencer, and at the time, at least, on the IonTOR and PGM. So LymphoTrack provides a practical NGS solution that can bring diagnostic resolution for difficult cases in the routine clinical laboratory setting. Interpretation of PCR results for lymphoid clonality detection is known to be subjective. LymphoTrack NGS objectively delineates predominant clonotypic IGH or TCR sequences with single nucleotide base pair resolution and specificity. LymphoTrack NGS may also be useful in the assessment of clonal relatedness among lesions involving multifocal disease, and this clonotypic sequence identity can be also important because it underlies essentially the logic for serial testing and MRD analysis. So I'll move on from TCR and IGH clonality assessment to the last part, which is just IGHV somatic hypermutation analysis in CLL-SLL. CLL-SLL is the most common leukemia diagnosed among adults in Western countries. Clinical outcomes are known to be heterogeneous, and IGHV somatic hypermutation status is an essential baseline prognostic factor in this disease. People have written about for years a variety of different prognostic biomarkers in this setting, but in the CLL International Prognostic Index, in terms of laboratory parameters, IGHV somatic hypermutation status is one of the most important and standard components of the CLL IPI. In cases that have less than 97% sequence homology, they can be considered to be hypermutated and prognostically favorable when matched against germline reference normal controls. Cases that show 97 to 98% homology may be considered borderline. Some people just use a 98% cutoff, but in my practice, I've often looked at cases as 97 to 98% homology, or conversely, 2 to 3% mutation rate is borderline cases, and greater than 98% sequence homology, or conversely less than 2% mutation rate, are considered unmutated and unfavorable prognostic status. So a little bit confusing with the logic perhaps, but laboratories have typically, because IGHV somatic hypermutation is difficult to and not widespread necessarily, but flow cytometry is more accessible. People have done ZAP70 and CD38 as surrogate biomarkers, but those are known to be very imperfect surrogate biomarkers for IGHV somatic hypermutation status. This is the definitive marker that anything else would be a surrogate, and it's one of the most important biomarkers for prognostication in a very high abundance leukemia subtype in adults. So we looked at our experience among 25 cases, flow cytometry positive clonal CLL patient samples from bone marrow and peripheral blood, and we used to send out for a national reference lab for RNA extraction and PCR amplification and Sanger sequencing. That's the traditional approach that a lot of laboratories employ for IGHV somatic hypermutation analysis, is they start with the RNA, and in that, among these 25 cases, it was a major problem because RNA, of course, is labile and subject to sample degradation in transit. And among these 25 cases, 5 of them were negative or no clonal population detected, which is an obvious false negative because these are flow cytometry known clonal positive cases. And when we ran the LymphoTrack NGS, we were able to delineate the clonal population sequence of interest in 100% of the cases. So it basically led to a 25% in diagnostic sensitivity improvement right off the bat, just due to being able to delineate the clonal sequences of interest. There was 100% fidelity between VJ utilization profiles between the LymphoTrack, once we brought it in-house, and the National Reference Lab send-out results. And also, I was very impressed at the fidelity between the hypermutation rates among the two assays as well. So 25 cases were evaluated by both gold standard Sanger sequencing performed at an outside national reference lab and NGS LymphoTrack. Sanger sequencing had a 5 out of 25 or 1/5, 20% failure rate, whereas NGS detected clonal populations as expected in all cases, and there was 100% concordance among evaluable cases between LymphoTrack and the Sanger sequencing results. Also, again, Sanger sequencing, as you know, has a LOD of about 15 to 20%, and the LymphoTrack in our hands at the time had a 3% limit of detection for clonal sequences. This was one of the key cases that was a failure to detect clonal population at the outside national reference lab, and it's a very egregious false negative. This was a 54-year-old male with CLL with one of the highest white counts I've encountered so far, as hyperleukocytosis, 302,000 overall white count, and absolute lymphocyte count 285. And FISH was, these are standard prognostic biomarkers. People typically employ FISH panel. Trisomy 12 is usually associated with variant immunophenotypic or morphologic features, and del13q is generally considered to be a favorable prognostic biomarker. Clearly, this patient is presenting essentially an extremis with hyperleukocytosis. It's not favorable. These were the flow results here, demonstrating a 19.5 positive monoclonal population, and this is the clonal sequence abundance as depicted on this 3D bar graph in the LymphoTrack assay. And the LymphoTrack demonstrated 100% IGH sequence homology to germline, so it confirmed unmutated disease status. And furthermore, V321 utilization was noted, which is established as an important biomarker that can essentially override the somatic hypermutation status. So in cases that are somatic hypermutated or positive and favorable, even if there's a V321 VJ utilization profile demonstrated, then it's considered unfavorable, and the patients are treated differently as a result of that. So this was a major, eye-opening case for me that I said, well, one, we got results very quickly. Number two, it had, unmutated disease status confirmed and V321 family usage noted. Now, the ERIC guidelines provide some of the rationale for how you would approach this kind of testing. I won't say that conformance to ERIC guidelines is standard throughout the industry. The European Research and CLL Group first published guidelines for Sanger sequencing interpretation of IGHV somatic hypermutation in 2007. So their 10-year anniversary article in Leukemia had extremely explicit notice on which frameworks to target, essentially, for somatic hypermutation analysis. So I'll just draw your attention, and it's pretty explicit that it says framework 1, 2, and 3 primers are not acceptable. You need to use 5' leader. And I don't, forgive me for, basically reading a quote in a presentation, but leader primers are the only recommended option. That said, in rare cases when leader primers are unsuccessful at providing a product that can be sequenced, and then in that setting, VH framework 1 primers are used. They're discouraged for the determination of somatic hypermutation status. The report should indicate that the use of VH framework 1 primers might underestimate the total number of IGHV somatic hypermutations as part of the VH domain is missing. So the leader sequence has, in the LymphoTrack assays, targets a 483 base pair length range. And the framework 1 is 295 base pairs. So it stands to reason intuitively that when you target a longer range sequence, you're going to have a more accurate assessment in an overall sense for what is the degree of sequence match to germline normal controls, and hence your percentage homology assessment. I think intuitively it makes sense that when the target base pair length is longer, it's likely to be more accurate. Also, targeting a longer sequence is beneficial, again, because if you have a highly somatically hypermutated case, such as a post-terminal center B-cell neoplasm or others, it can overcome limitations that might be associated with PCR if you have failure of primer annealing, so in focal areas. So we looked at 50 cases tested by NGS LymphoTrack Framework 1 versus NGS leader sequence, and we had basically 45 out of 50 cases showed appropriate concordance in terms of their somatic hypermutation results, as well as the VJ family utilization profile delineated by the assay. But among 5 cases, there were indeed differences notable between using just Framework 1 versus leader. And the trend is, at least among 4 of the 5 cases, these you could potentially consider as borderline 2 to 3% sequence homology. They all showed greater than 3% mutation rate, hence hypermutated and prognostically favorable versus borderline. So the leader, in a sense, might be considered as clarifying and rendering a more accurate results versus the use of the more focal Framework 1 primer set. In this case, there was one discordance noted here, but there's also some subtle discordances in VJ utilization profiles. The other thing I'll mention is if you use conventional traditional Sanger sequencing, it's almost impossible to discern when you have biclonal or biallelic rearrangements present, what are the hypermutation rates, and especially if they're discordant, where perhaps one predominant clonal sequence present in sample is mutated and then the other sequence is unmutated. The ERIC guidelines are pretty clear that it's unclear what that means prognostically for those particular patients. They're rare, but the beauty of the NGS LymphoTrack assay is you can readily examine all of the sequences in sample, all of the hypermutation rates associated with each of the sequences, not just the clonal predominant sequences, and that's a significant difference in comparison to Sanger sequencing. It's very difficult to discern variant mutation profiles in oligoclonal or biallelic samples. So in summary, LymphoTrack NGS confers significant advantages over traditional methodologies. NGS may show improved sensitivity in detection of clonal populations. DNA is an acceptable specimen substrate for IGHV somatic hypermutation analysis, eliminating the practical constraints typically associated with RNA-based Sanger sequencing PCR-based testing. I've definitely had cases that they had indicated, we forgot to order the IGHV somatic hypermutation status, and we had a sample in the fridge for a month in RPMI fluid, and we were able to obtain results effectively with the LymphoTrack DNA-based assay. So add-on requests that are well extended beyond the RNA labelity period would be a significant practical benefit in the routine clinical laboratory setting. NGS also significantly streamlines laboratory workflow. We experienced 3-day clinical reporting is feasible. The assay hands-on time, this is actually one of the easiest assays on the market for hands-on library prep, I'm told. It's basically a experience of mixing the master mix together with Taq polymerase, and there's very few pipetting steps required. So batch multiplexing of patient samples can be leveraged to facilitate significant reductions in cost and labor. In our laboratory, when we wanted to go through our optimization and familiarization phase for this assay, it took only 1 month to go across at least, I think we ran four different runs for those 50, not completely all 50 samples, but we basically had, I think, like 4 runs and 50 for the 50 samples in question to optimize and familiarize in our hands the assay in terms of which Taq polymerase concentration do we wish to use, how much DNA input volume and concentration do we wish to use on if this is brought into clinical production. That took us 1 month. So that's, I think, of the ease of use and the potential ease of implementation was, in my mind, a major advantage and positive factor. So my concluding remarks are NGS may underrepresent FLT3 ITD mutant to wild type allele ratios. Leukostrat PCR is a useful diagnostic adjunct to ensure accurate AML risk stratification, critically important to guiding marrow transplantation. LymphoTrack NGS provides a robust NGS solution for clonality detection in B-cell and T-cell lymphoid malignancies. And LymphoTrack NGS confers significant practical and technical advantages compared to traditional methodologies for IGHV somatic hypermutation analysis and CLL/SLL. So with that, I thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.